Hello, students. Welcome to Chapter 10 on Emotional Development and Attachment. We're going to go over these couple topics and try to take a look at them all throughout the lifespan, one at a time. So, starting with emotion, quick definition here. Emotions are feelings, or they're also called affects. So, if you ever think of what is the correct way to say affect or effect, affect in psychology is a feeling. So, that's a feeling that occurs when you're in a state or interaction that's important to yourself and your well-being. So, positive emotions are things like joy, love, enthusiasm. Negative emotions are things like anger, guilt, sadness, anxiety. And we call these positive and negative because we tend not to enjoy the experience of anxiety, anger, guilt, or sadness, but they can be really useful and important as well, versus we tend to enjoy the feelings of joy and love and enthusiasm. So that's kind of why we name them positive and negative emotions. So with this, emotions are really important as we communicate. So if you are in a social setting, your responses, your interactions, this should all be one sentence rather than bullet points for each of these words. So that's kind of funny. But yeah, emotions are important in about everything we do. You may or may not have seen the series Bones. Essentially, in there's an anthropologist, which an anthropologist is a type of social psychologist. So it's kind of a funny thing that basically hates psychology, hates other social sciences, even though they would have definitely had to have gone through a lot of social science methods classes. So this character should actually know more about social sciences than they appear to. Anyway, they always talk about how they're a very rational person and they don't use their emotions at all. And in the show, you can kind of see, well, yeah, they're definitely using their emotions. And it's kind of a funny juxtaposition because almost everything that we do in life is using emotion, right? That emotion part of our brain is really close to the very middle. So a lot of the things that we do and decide and think about have some emotion included in them, whether it's something really big and dramatic for you, like um, dating someone. Should you continue dating this person? Should you not? Maybe something like, what should we do about people who are unhoused? Maybe it should be something like voting. A lot of times those things bring up emotion in people, but even other things that you wouldn't even necessarily realize, emotion comes into play, at least a little bit. And we can see that in brain scans, even if you're not necessarily aware of how those emotions are affecting your processing. So if you think back to memories, you might have some positive emotions in memories or negative emotions in memories. That memory, what was going on during that time, that part of that memory is the emotion. All right, so infants learn behaviors that are adaptive through social responses that are driven by their emotions. So they have an emotion and it kind of drives them to behave a certain way. So infants can communicate through their joy or through their sadness. They can use their interest or fear. So it's almost like some of the Inside Out creators talked to some psychologists about what emotions kind of are there in the brain right at the beginning. And those are some of them. So there are biological, cognitive, and environmental influences on emotion and from emotions as well. So the brainstem, hippocampus, and amygdala, all of these play a role in emotions. Just like I said, these are in that kind of central area where there's a lot of networking happening through them throughout the brain. So the regulation of emotion, like controlling it, helping yourself calm down, focusing your attention on something else, processing something that seems a little complex and then getting like really upset about it, or maybe you're laughing about it, whatever it might be. A lot of that is happening in the prefrontal cortex. So it is involved in this process too. Again, a lot of areas of the brain are involved in a lot of different processes. So the area of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is not completely finished myelinating until closer to about age 23, might be to 25 in some, might be a little earlier for some. But with this, as that frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex develop, well, the children are also learning cognitive strategies to control their emotions. So if you do intentionally try to help children train and think about their emotions, more of these networks will be created in the prefrontal cortex. So, with that being said, one of the best ways to help solve any negative emotion is distraction. Distraction works really well, distracting away from a negative experience. They stub their toe, they're really sad about something, their food fell on the floor, whatever it might be. And distraction can actually work pretty well into adulthood as well. You can even use distraction on yourself to try and regulate your own emotions, focus on something else, like intentionally distract yourself, do something distracting. Having a partner do something distracting can really help your brain swap out of that loop of continuously going through this emotion. Oftentimes we're thinking about it in a sense of a negative emotion. So rather than like running through that over and over and over again, you get distracted to something else. Makes it easier for your prefrontal cortex to kind of take over and say, hey, let's do something else at this point. So again, though, for an infant, that prefrontal cortex is just getting started with its wiring up and figuring out how to do all of this. So as a parent or a caregiver or like a teacher or a daycare worker, a nurse, you'd have to do more of that, both distraction and focusing on something else. So think of like giving a vaccine. Child might be sad, might start crying, distracting with a sticker or a cute little toy or something like that is not a bad idea. So, emotion is really critical to developing attachment, and we'll talk about attachment styles later in this chapter. But a family that laughs versus argues together, it's going to change the way the emotions are happening in the house. Positive interactions with infants can lead to positive emotions. They can be reinforcers themselves. It can lead to different social interactions, hopefully what we like to call positive upward spirals. So if you're having positive interactions, you're probably having positive emotions. It's reinforcing. You have more of those interactions, you have more positive emotions. It's like a positive cycle up. So children become better able to manage their emotions through what's called sensitive caregiving. And so that term is in your book quite a few times. Sensitive caregiving is essentially just being able to respond quickly and appropriately to the needs of a child. So if they're hungry, you can tell that they are hungry and getting them food as quickly as you're able to. If they are have a wet diaper, you can tell what's going on and you're able to respond fairly quickly to taking care of that. So getting them what they need as quickly as possible. Also, with this being said, I do bring it up, but one of the best ways to help children learn to regulate emotions is to model regulation of emotions and to kind of help calm them down and cuddle them to help them regulate their emotions as well. So, sensitive caregiving is a really good portion here. Here, I'm going to click on this link, and this is from a researcher named Darcy Narvaez. So I'll just put this website up. Oh, actually, this is the same article that I have right here on the slide. So I do have the website up, but I don't think I'll actually show it. So essentially, this is a researcher who, as they do a research project, they have enough funding in their lab that they're able to also write things onto like blogs or more down-to-earth kind of writings like this in Psychology Today. And so if you do go to this website, so maybe that is a good reason to pull it up right here. If you go here, you can find a lot of their writing. If you go to their lab's website, you can find a lot of things that they've written in addition to the published research papers in peer-reviewed journals. They've done a really good job of also talking about their research in a way that parents, that even teens can understand. They try to write a lot of things at like a high school reading level. Some of the things are more like an undergraduate college level. But it is a lot more easy to read than, say, a research paper. This is much shorter and a little more focused on some specific things for parents than a research paper would be. That one in and of itself is pretty long because it's such a big topic in parent and caregiving. So this paper specifically, or this research, essentially shows that kids need to learn how to network their brains to regulate their emotion. So how do they learn to do that? Well, really with practice, just like a lot of the things that we've talked about along development and gross motor skills, you've got to learn through practice. So for a child, it's really hard to practice. You're stressed out. You don't know what to do. You don't know how to get not stressed out anymore, whether you're tired, whether you just got hurt, whether you're just scared of something. So having a parent literally like pick you up, hold you close, take some slow breaths will help a child to mirror that. So the warmth and the comfort from the parent will help the child start to release hormones of love and things that help its brain calm down. And also seeing that pattern of, you're breathing slowly, you're intentionally trying to be calm, that will help start teaching the child to do that as well. As they start mimicking that, they'll notice also, even not like consciously perceiving it, that they are starting to calm down. So by doing this, by being there with a child to help them calm down, that is the best way to get them to regulate themselves. The idea behind crying it out is you let them cry in the crib. Eventually they'll stop crying because the idea was they've now regulated themselves. They've figured out how to control their emotions. In reality, that's not what has happened. So when they're crying it out, it goes back to behaviorism. So if you remember that, if you've taken general psych class, so behaviors will go extinct oftentimes if they're not adaptive. And so essentially, the child has learned no one's coming to help me. It doesn't do any good if I cry, and they're not crying, but they're still stressed. So if you put an EEG on that baby's head, they're still stressed out, but they're just not crying. So it might be easier for the parent. It's not actually good for the baby. So to actually teach the baby to calm down, you do need to be able to work on calming down yourself and showing that as a model. It helps them see what the body should be doing, and it gets their brain that start of that practice of what to do to regulate. And again, by doing those practices, they're going to be making connections to be able to regulate. All right, so this is very important in social relationships. So infants all the way up through adults are interacting with people in a variety of different ways. So without experiencing emotions, it's not possible to learn how to regulate them. It's really hard. It's kind of like riding a bike. Bike. It's kind of like riding a bike. You could read all you want about riding a bike, but it's still going to be hard to do until you practice it. You can get some ideas, right? But you're going to need to do and learn this skill. And that's what it is. Emotion regulation is a skill that people can learn, they can get better at over time. So some of the innate emotions we've already alluded to, surprise, joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, they seem to be there right when a baby is born. So all those emotions are things that we have definitely observed in infants right after birth. Within the first 2 years, depending on the child, depending on how quickly they're like seeing that other people have different perspectives, different lives, we see things like jealousy, embarrassment, pride, shame, and guilt. So with that, empathy is listed here is in the book, but we actually see seeds of empathy innately as well. We see that children can take the same emotion as other children around them or even other parents. So like someone else is crying, they might start crying as well. So they can share those emotions, but the full-on empathy where you take someone's perspective, that actually doesn't come till a little bit later into about middle childhood when you can think abstractly to like put yourself in someone else's shoes. So it's kind of innate, but it's not all the way cooked yet. It's a pretty complex emotion because it's cognitive as well as this affect of the feeling. So self-conscious emotions require that sense of I or me as separate from the parent. And that is a thing that it's hard to tell exactly when that comes online. So it's hard to tell when a infant has a sense that they are a separate entity from the mother and the people around them. Because again, we can't ask them these questions. We have to use a lot of behavioral measures, watch what they do. So they might not quite recognize themselves as a separate being from their primary caregivers until closer to a year old, just because they don't have the cognitive capacity to think about it in that sense. So they don't quite yet have that sense of I or me as a different thing than this is just what's happening in life, rather than this is what's happening to me, that is happening to mom, that kind of thing. That might not be clear to them until closer to a year old with more experience. So let's watch a short video on empathy specifically, especially in regards to pro-social behavior. This is one of the most important emotions in relation to developing pro-social behavior and a lot of moral behavior in general.
You know when you're reading a really good book and something intense happens to one of your favorite characters, so you are also hit with like a wave of feelings? You might feel a little silly as you reach for a box of tissues, but it's a normal human thing to understand and relate to other people's feelings, even fictional people. We call this empathy. Empathy might seem pretty straightforward, but we know from research that it involves a complex network of brain areas that process things like emotion, thought, and understanding social cues. Many of these brain regions aren't fully developed until late adolescence or early adulthood, so it takes a while for little kids to get it right. To understand the different pieces of the empathy puzzle, scientists often divide it into three components: emotional, motivational, and cognitive. And to figure out how and when empathy develops naturally, researchers study how kids behave in different situations. The emotional part refers to sharing someone else's feelings. For example, researchers have tested this by monitoring brain activity as adults watch someone else's hand getting poked with a needle. And you're like your brain does things. And the brains of people watching typically show a similar response pattern to the person actually being poked. This suggests that we actually feel something similar when we see someone in pain. And it seems like this kind of empathy may develop pretty quickly. We think babies as young as 6 to 8 months show early signs of it when they make sound.
So I'll jump in here because some studies have shown it that time. Other more recent studies have also shown it earlier, like immediately after birth as well.
Sounds or facial expressions that mirror others who are upset. Next up is the motivational component, which is basically the urge to do something for someone else's well-being, like wanting to comfort a friend when they've lost a pet or family member. And even though children might mirror each other's emotions early on, it takes a few years for this motivational part to kick in. When they're about 3 to 6 years old, kids might show behaviors like sharing their favorite stuffed animal to make someone else feel better when they seem sad. Now, the third and maybe most complicated part of empathy is the cognitive component. In the research world, this is sometimes called theory of mind. It's the ability to take another person's perspective, think about their experience, and understand why it would make them feel the way they do. This requires some mental gymnastics, so it's not a huge surprise that it seems to be the hardest part of empathy for young children to do well, and it's easy to mistake for selfishness or meanness. One of the most well-known ways to study theory of mind is called a false belief task. Like there's the Sally Ann task, which involves a short scenario that gets played out with dolls. It goes like this. Sally has a basket, and her friend Ann has a box. Sally puts a marble in her basket and then leaves to go for a walk. While Sally is gone, Ann takes the marble from the basket and puts it into her own box. Jerk move, Anne. After all this, researchers ask children where Sally will look for the marble when she gets back. Kids under 3 years of age will usually say that Sally will look in Anne's box because they saw the marble move, which sounds a little weird to our adult brains. From other questions, researchers can tell that kids are following the logic of the story and understand that Sally didn't see the marble move. But it seems like they have trouble understanding or expressing the fact that Sally's perspective is different from their own. Some researchers think that even if young kids might get that people have different feelings or perspectives, they can't describe it with their cognitive and language abilities. Because the brain systems involved in these abilities become more efficient as connections between neurons develop and change, by age 4 to 5, answers start to change. Basically, their brains are more able to process complex information, so more kids say that Sally would look in her own basket for the marble because that's where she left it. Now, the jury's still out.
So with that, those are some of the components of empathy and how they develop over time. And that last part, that cognitive piece of really putting yourself in someone else's shoes, it's a pretty complex feat for a brain. So if you're listening to this, I'm sure you've been doing that for many, many years. So it might seem a little strange, but it does seem like for early children, even into middle childhood, they don't quite have that capacity wired up to really put themselves in people's shoes and see that they do have a different perspective than you. So if you've ever had the experience where you're driving down the road and you look at someone jamming out to music in the car next to you and you're like, man, they're living a whole different life. Like their life is different. They're worried about things that I just have no idea about. A young child wouldn't have that kind of thought. Or maybe I'm just bored driving to work. That being said, it also shows that the way we test these things with conversations with kids, it does make it hard. So maybe it is a little earlier that happens. Because one thing that we do see as well is when you do something like watching movies or shows or reading books with children and asking them questions about the perspective of those characters, the more practice a child gets with that, the easier they are able to talk about it. So probably two things are happening. Probably one, they are getting the language and getting practice with the language to describe what is going on. And two, their brains are probably working to wire it up. So that's one thing that we've seen a lot is watching shows with kids, talking about the feelings of the characters in the show, the motivations of the characters in a show, those kinds of things, or in a book, is a really good way to build empathy. And it also helps with a lot of other emotions too. So I have a note for myself here to discuss moral emotions like guilt, anger, and empathy. So the reason these are called moral emotions, usually scientists, when we say moral, we're talking about pro-social, things that are good for people, good for society in general. That's what a moral behavior is something that is pro-social, pro-society, pro-other people around us. So moral emotions like empathy, pretty clear. Like see someone hurting, you help that person. But anger, why is that a moral emotion? Guilt, why is that a moral emotion? Well, anger can motivate change, right? You can be angry at something that is unjust and work to change that for the betterment of people. Guilt, you maybe hurt someone and now you want to fix that thing that you hurt, right? So you want to make amends for that. So that is why guilt is a moral emotion as well. All right, so with this, we do have these different behaviors as we are showing these emotions. So there are a couple different kinds of cries. I've tried to find good videos of babies crying. I'm sure I'm on some FBI watch lists because of that, searching for baby crying videos. But yeah, basic cry is kind of a pretty standard cry that you've probably heard from babies, and it's a little different than an anger cry or a pain cry. And babies have pretty similar responses to these, kind of like humans have pretty similar smiles for being happy. All babies have pretty similar overall tones for their basic anger and pain cry. So basic is pretty rhythmic. There's a brief silence, a short high pitch, then a louder main cry, a little bit of a rest before the next cry out. Versus an anger cry, there's a lot more air forced through the vocal cords, pushing a lot more air, making a different noise with that. And with the pain cry, this one actually reminds me if you've ever seen like the meme of Peter Griffin from Family Guy, like stubbing a toe and like holding their breath in for many times. That's kind of what a pain cry does. You have a sudden, long, loud cry followed by breath holding as they're like breathing in and then a long, loud cry again. So they are quite different of cries. And all babies kind of do the same sort of pattern cross-culturally, which is really interesting. So smiling is an interesting thing in young infants. We have a reflexive smile. So this is just a smile that happens. It doesn't seem to be in response to external stimuli. This is usually what you see in very early children. So if a new parent has brought their kid home and it's 3 days later, they're like, "Oh, look, they're already smiling at me." No, they're probably having a reflex because they just pooped their pants. Sorry. It does endear the child to the parent, though, so probably don't tell them that. But that's probably what's actually happening. Social smile is in response to external stimuli, and that doesn't really start until a couple months into a life. So, stranger anxiety, so the emotion of fear, this appears at about 6 months. Some children will have it, some children will not have that kind of stranger anxiety. It could be really extreme or basically non-existent. So separation protest is another behavior we might see from fear, is being distressed when a caregiver leaves. So you might see that in our videos on attachment. So emotion regulation and coping, kids in their first years are developing these abilities to minimize the intensity of their emotions, both positive and negative, to calm down so their emotional reactions don't last as long, figuring out how to distract themselves, figuring out things that they like to do, whether it be something like sucking on a binky or holding a blankie, right? Or cuddling with the dog. Hopefully the dog likes it too, right? So they're figuring out what works to help them calm down. And talking to self is also a pretty common thing to do. So I know I emotionally regulate when I'm doing like stats by talking to myself. It also does actually help with like memory and thinking through problems. But yeah, infants depend on their caregiver to show them how to do these things. So a caregiver that is consistently giving them a blankie and kind of bouncing them and talking to them and helping them calm down, that's going to help them learn that behavior themselves so that in the future they will be able to do this on their own. But in their first year, babies are not capable of complete emotion regulation on their own. So again, Cry it out, doesn't work. So context matter as well. So if you're tired, if you're hungry, if there's too many people around them, too many noises in a different place, it's too hot, it's too cold, that can change your emotions. I'm sure you've experienced this yourself. There's a thing I tell my kids they're doing is that they're being a hunger grump sometimes. So if there's any kind of hunger pains that they're experiencing, oftentimes my kids, even though they're getting a little bit older into well, start of adolescence and also middle childhood right now, uh, when they get hungry, they get more grumpy. And so I can tell if I've gone a little bit past their normal dinner time and they're starting to fight more, well, they're being hunger grumps, right? So those kind of contexts matter. So if they're hungry and that's why they're more emotional, well, obviously you should also feed them. That would be sensitive caregiving, right? Giving them food as well as helping them calm down in infancy. So because they're not going to understand that, well, I'm hungry and that's why I'm angry, or I'm sleepy and that's why I'm angry, or I had too much Halloween candy and that's why I feel this way. So with this, mothers with depression do rock and soothe their babies less. They're less interactive, a little less quick and sensitive in their responses. And this does lead to less effective child coping strategies, which is kind of a little bit of a one-two punch because there are genetic components that are related to depression as well. So that child probably has those genetic components, and then how they're also not getting sensitive caregiving. So it makes it a little bit more likely. It's one of the things that also makes it a little more likely that a child with a mother who suffered depression, especially like postpartum depression, will be more likely to suffer depression themselves. So, with that, this is again partially based on those genes. So, that mother might already have those genes, have passed those genes on to be a little more likely to have depression. But then also, this experience is a negative downward spiral, multiple risk factors adding up. So self-awareness is another thing related to feeling more and more emotions. So as you understand your own emotions and as you're controlling them better, and as your brain is wiring up and you're understanding other people's emotions better, you can do a much better job at making sense of people's behavior. So why did this kid take all the pink blocks when you wanted to build with the pink blocks? It's not just because they're being mean to you or they're a jerk. It's because they wanted the pink blocks. And so maybe it makes it easier to interact with them versus just being mad that now your blocks are gone. So self-conscious emotions like pride, guilt, and embarrassment become more common across early childhood. So as we're able to understand how people see us and that other people have slightly different perspectives and things like that, this is a lot better, or getting a lot better over time through practice. So parents expressing emotion also helps this happen sooner. It also helps children learn how to express emotion appropriately. So at age 2 to 4, a lot of children use lots of words to describe their emotion, what causes the feelings. At 4 to 5, they can see that different people can feel differently in the same situation. So while this situation made you feel happy, it made this kid feel sad. And by age 5, they can describe their emotions and even think of strategies to help if they're having negative emotions. So all of this is coming from practicing those emotions and practicing social interactions, seeing models like parents, caregivers, using emotions and regulating emotions and things like that. So emotion regulation really helps with conflicts and interacting with others. So I'm sure all of us here have been mad at our boss or annoyed at someone in our life at some point or another. So regulating that is very helpful in interacting with those people. You don't want to necessarily tell your boss off every time they make you annoyed because you might not have a job for very long. It's maybe not a good idea, right? So you need to learn these regulation skills. So executive function is critical for this regulation. It's getting better all the time through childhood with more practice. So again, doing specific exercises to try and work on regulating and teaching regulation skills is really good. One that my child really likes is it's called balloon breaths. They visualize that there's a balloon like hovering up in the sky with a string attached to it. And so they might if they're able to, they will literally like take their hands and pull the balloon down. And as they're doing it, they're breathing slowly. And then once they get the balloon down to themselves, they take A big breath. And sometimes they like to imagine it's different combinations of colors, like maybe the blue's purple, but the string is pink or whatever it might be. So they take a big breath, release the balloon, and then depending on how they feel, they might pull another balloon down and do it again. So that's one that they really like. So try out different strategies. That's not one that I specifically taught them. I think one of their classes at school mentioned that one. So, emotion coaching parents monitor children's emotions. They look for the emotions, they're paying attention to how their child is feeling. And anytime a negative emotion arises, it's a teaching moment. They're able to label the emotions, they can coach and teach the child how to deal with the emotions, teach a strategy like that. One that I often use because, or tell my children to use, is just slow, deep breaths. So, in your nose, out your mouth. Another thing I tell them to do is called hand breaths because it helps them kind of focus on something else. And you, for most people, you've got your hands with you all the time. So basically, they will trace their fingers like this as they breathe in and out or in and out, however they want to do it, but just in a pattern like that. And going slower is good. And so you can do that in, say, a classroom. So if they're upset and they do that like under a desk, and that can help with anxiety or anger as well. So coaching on those different strategies, looking up different things, trying things out and noticing this one worked better, this one didn't work better. They're really excited about this one. Oh, they hate that one now. And oftentimes that's what happens with my children. Is they'll do one for a while, they're like, "No, I'm not going to do that. I don't like it anymore." So we've got to try a new strategy now. So with that, use scaffolding. More simple things are easier to begin, especially in early childhood. Uh, One that can work and maybe be distracting is try to blow like a candle breath. You don't necessarily want an actual candle in any given situation, but you could have a string and try to blow like literally a string. So, and that's a really good way to help calm down because that helps your body send through the somatosensory system and the rest of your nervous system. It's changing the hormone levels in your body, and you're getting messages to start calming down. And the hormones help flood and help you actually calm down, change some of those neurotransmitters and patterns in your brain. So parents who are emotion coaching do a good job of this emotion regulation and modeling it and supporting it versus emotion dismissing parents will deny, ignore, or try to change the negative emotions. So these kind of phrases at the bottom of the screen, "stop crying," would be a good example of that, or it wasn't that bad, right? So child falls off a bike, emotion dismissing parent might say, "It wasn't that bad. You can just get back up, ignore it." Right. And there might be contexts where they can ignore things. Maybe they are usually regulating, and so for this specific instance or for a second, maybe that's fine, right? But for an emotion dismissing parent, they're not modeling emotion regulation. They're rejecting the emotions that children have. They're not trying to help and teach and support them through this kind of emotional process that the children are going through. And again, if children aren't learning this from the people around them, they can learn it later, but it's going to be harder, right? So emotion coaching parents tend to have better regulated children with better regulated emotion versus emotion dismissing parents have children that don't know necessarily how to regulate their emotion. They might not try to show it. You might call it repress it as well. They might not show those emotions. They might feel it, but just try not to show it to the people around them. And that's not as healthy as calming yourself down. If you're still stressed out, even if you don't look stressed out, you've still got those stress hormones and your brain's still working at an amped up rate. So, with this, understanding emotions improves throughout middle to late childhood. Through late childhood, we see that mental time travel appears. So, this isn't like jumping in a TARDIS, but you can plan forward and think ahead to how you might feel in any given situation. So, you can look forward and say, "Oh, tomorrow's Halloween. That's going to be really exciting. I'm going to have so much fun going to all the houses," right? Or you can mentally time travel back as well to say, "Oh, I remember when that happened. That made me really sad." So you can predict what might happen, and you can use that to plan, "Oh, if I said this in this kind of situation, that might make my friend really sad. But if I said this, that may make them feel really happy." So it can really help build our social capacities. So emotions really affect a lot of our lives that we might not have necessarily thought of before. And also, they're understanding that more than one emotion can occur in any given situation. So you might have something that's really exciting, but also a little anxiety inducing at the same time. Let's say you're scared of some of the decorations on Halloween, but you're really excited about going for trick-or-treating on Halloween, as another example there. So, depending on when you're watching this, you can probably tell I'm recording this nearby Halloween time. So, with this, they are also a lot better at identifying their own emotional states, pinpointing the source of the emotion, like where is it coming from? Oh, I'm sad because this happened. I'm sad because my friend is not in school today. I'm excited because tomorrow is Halloween or my birthday. So suppressing or concealing emotions improves as well. So that's not necessarily a positive thing, right? So if they're not actually doing something to regulate and calm down, just suppressing and concealing the emotion isn't necessarily a positive thing. But as we talked about, our social interactions with people, if you're mad at someone and it's important that you kind of mask that anger for a moment, that can be beneficial to social situations. So then maybe you can leave the social situations, go take some breaths, calm down, and figure out how to solve whatever problem it is. Because maybe you were really wronged, right? But maybe in the given situation, it wouldn't have been a very good idea to like snap at a person. So that is a good example of that. All right, with late childhood, you're getting a lot better at regulating yourself now. You will hopefully have had emotion coaching and you have a bunch of strategies that you can just use without necessarily being prompted. But it's not uncommon still for children to be starting to feel overwhelmed, even in late childhood or into adolescence or even an adult, to prompt and help encourage them to emotionally regulate. So, with this, being able to distract themselves versus having someone else distract them becomes a lot easier as well. At this point, you should be able to expect, especially if you're to rank your emotions from like a level 1 to 10, like 10 being like really intensive emotions versus 1 being like very low intensity, like number 10, you're the maddest you've ever been in your life versus 1, you're like, I'm a little mad at you right now. It's a lot easier to soothe yourself in those lower numbers than as we get to those higher numbers, even for adolescents and adults. But also, this is the cool time when that capacity for genuine empathy appears. So, not only that feeling what someone else is feeling, if they're pinpricked or something like that, or they got hurt and stubbed their toe, or they're feeling loss, but also taking their perspective. This is about the time in late childhood, so like 7, 8, 9, maybe 6, depending on the children, depending if you're like practicing this, when they can really take someone else's perspective, put themselves in their shoes and think, how would I feel in that kind of situation? Now, in puberty, we see a lot of myelination in the areas that are around emotion. So the ones that we talked about in the beginning of this conversation, right there in the middle of the brain, those are getting myelinated. So the limbic system, the amygdala, these areas are finishing up their myelination. So it's a lot faster and easier, just more efficient for the brain to use those areas. And the brain will default to that. It will want to be more efficient, so it will run a lot of things through that emotion center of the brain versus the prefrontal cortex where the regulation like calming down intentionally happens. That doesn't finish myelinating until around 23. So in reality, adolescents really are feeling more emotions and stronger emotions than they were at any other time in their life. Basically, the capacity to feel these emotions has been building, and it kind of hits a peak here in adolescence. And that is one reason that we see adolescents are so emotional because one, they haven't had as many years as, say, an adult to practice regulating their emotions. And two, this is new to feel these emotions so strongly. Hormones are affecting things. So these other contexts, like the hormones in their body, kind of like the hunger grump example earlier. So those hormones are making their emotions change more dramatically. And since they don't have as much practice and their brain wants to default to the fast network of emotion, then it will do that. We can, as an adolescent, still use that prefrontal cortex to calm down. It takes a little work, and but it can be done. So with that, decision making at this point in adolescence is very important. That prefrontal cortex is doing this kind of executive function. So, this ability to regulate emotions, think clearly about things, really set out a plan gets better and better across adolescence. So, you'd expect a 12-year-old or a 12th grader to be better at it than an eighth grader. You'd expect an eighth grader to be better at it than a fifth grader. And they're just getting better and better at using these prefrontal cortex processing as they're practicing it over time. Also, giving them the opportunity to make choices, to practice those things, to use these skills and capacities that they're building is another big thing. And that's one thing we often see. We'll talk about in parenting. Oftentimes, parents are giving children more and more room to grow, freedom, ability to make choices, more independence. Then, once they get to be about adolescence, they start to cut back on that as a pattern. Not every single parent. This is not always the case, but we often do see kind of a little bit more restrictions because there's a little bit more fear from those parents later on. All right, but adolescents are pretty capable of making pretty big decisions. They're making big decisions. We ask them to make decisions about like what major are you going to do? What's your career plan for the rest of your life going to look like at 18? Versus you wouldn't necessarily expect them to, a lot of times parents don't expect them to be responsible for some other things in life. So, jumping to another topic related to emotional development, attachment, other aspects of development over time is temperament. So, this is kind of what you might consider personality to an infant. And we'll go through it pretty quickly. But here is some of the original categories, and I think you can see from these names who defined them. It was the researchers or parents of children. So, an easy child was one who generally has a positive mood. They quickly establish routines, and then they can quickly change routines. So you take an easy child to grandma's house, their sleeping schedule might be weird the first night, but the second night they're getting back into their routine of eating and sleeping, and they generally have a positive mood. It's easier for parents or caregivers to take care of this child. Versus a difficult child has more negative reactions, cries more frequently, is harder to set routines with, even if it's a consistent place. And so that's the case for a lot of children. It's just hard to set routines. So with that, difficult child is also slow to adapt to change. So if you go to grandma's house, they're not going to be in their sleep schedule at all when they're at grandma's house over the weekend, and they're not going to get back to their sleep schedule for a couple days when they get back home, if they've even set a good sleep schedule. So this is pretty difficult for a parent to deal with, but it is a characterization or classification that we used to describe children's temperaments, which we kind of considered an infant personality style. The last one was slow to warm up children. These children have a generally low activity level. They're not like really sad or really happy, somewhat negative, but not like crying a lot. The generally low intensity of mood, they'll do somewhere in between the easy child and the difficult child for like getting set in routines. So as you can see, these are all kind of pretty much defined by people observing children from outside, and those researchers naming them. It's easy to take care of, difficult to take care of, or this child slow to warm up. More recently was by Rothbard and Bates, and it has these personality type traits on broad dimensions that are a lot more relevant to the cognition of a young person. So extroversion or surgency is like how much an infant's willing to like approach, how pleasant they are, how active or smiling, how laughy they are. Negative affectivity is a different category. So, how high or low are you on your fearfulness, your frustration, sadness, discomfort? Are you easily distressed or not? So, each of these is on a different scale. So, you could be high in extroversion and urgency and high in negative activity and various variations with that. Then effortful control is about a lot of things that are really relevant to our prefrontal cortex. So self-regulation, shifting attention, having attention, inhibitory control. And so these are a lot more relevant than that easy child, difficult child, slow to warm up child, but they are still pretty broad ways of describing people. And another big thing with personality in general and temperament in general is that these can be different depending on context. The original idea behind like a personality was to try and set like a bunch of traits that we could predict all of your behavior in every situation, but situations make our behavior different. So social psych has really shown us that as well. And so that's why a lot of personality programs are kind of absorbed by social psych programs. But yeah, this is still a relevant way and a lot more useful way to think about the temperament of young children. But let's jump ahead to attachment. So think about for a second what you read in your book about this monkey. This is Harlow's monkeys. Essentially, in this study, there were wire mothers that didn't have a cloth on them. This one that the monkey is on has a light bulb inside it as well. So it's a little bit warmer there. There's this, and then the other monkey was just a wire mesh that you can kind of see poking out right here. Hopefully, the lecture recording is actually picking that up. But it's basically a wire mesh, and on one mother, just wires. So just the wire mesh plus some nipples for milk. So they wanted to see, hey, is the monkey going to spend more time on the cuddly mother or the wire mother where it gets its food? This was coming after a time in our history where there was a lot of thoughts and ideas that you didn't really have to like interact with children or care for them, that as long as you provided for basic needs like a roof over their head or their food, they would turn out all right. And so we didn't have to really worry about actually taking care of the children. So with that, this was a good study to show, well, hey, even in monkeys, they prefer to stay on the cloth mother over the wire mother. So the monkeys really preferred the soft, cuddly mother with a warm light bulb under there, where they would get the cuddles, where they felt safe, versus the wire mother. They would go to the wire mother to feed, but that is about it. They would come back and spend their time here. So it really went to show that, hey, yeah, even monkeys are caring about attachment. And so, with this, most of the studies on attachment look at the bond with mother, but we've also done studies with attachment to father, attachment to siblings, attachment to grandparents or other caregivers, a nanny maybe. And so, that close bond between two people is what we call attachment. So, no matter who we're investigating here, again, most of the research is looking at the mother and the child. But when we look at the father and the child and how it develops, it's pretty much the same for all these different people. So, researching it from one person to another, you can kind of transfer the things learned to each different person. So with that, this is kind of the phases of development, and this is in your book. I just have it here kind of as a little study tool, but basically within the first couple of years, we develop a strong attachment to a caregiver. So with that, if you're in a situation where you get adopted or something, it's definitely going to take some time to develop that attachment to a new person. So part of the process of why it takes a long time here is also because you're learning and your brain is developing to make those kinds of connections. But you can see the seeds of this really immediately. In the first couple months, directing attention to like one specific person, usually if the two parents are co-parenting a lot, you might see about equal between parents. Attachment tends to focus on one figure, usually the primary caregiver. And so you might have slightly different attachments to different people. So as we go from that 7 months to all the way to basically 2 years, with more ability to move around, children seek out their preferred caregiver, their primary attachment source. And then as they become more aware of feelings and other people's goals, how people see them, changes how they feel about people as well. So children are developing their own essentially schema, how they see things from people around. So how they understand the relationships. And that's really the key piece of an attachment relationship early on in life is it gives you a little bit of a blueprint to then jump into other relationships, whether it's peer relationships or later on romantic relationships. It kind of sets you up with a little bit of a blueprint of how you expect close relationships should work. So the attachment is measured through the strange situation. Before the strange situation existed, essentially a researcher would go into someone's house, like obviously with consent, and observe for a couple hours, maybe even an entire day, what the interactions were like between the parent and the child. And to determine are they securely attached, are they insecurely attached, but that takes a long time. And if that's just the first step of your study to figure out what's their attachment style, now we're going to do this. That takes a while. So they developed the strange situation. It's an observational measure that's done in a lab. So you can do it in the floor below your office or something like that. And essentially, you go through a couple of interactions with a parent and stranger. So you start off with the parent and the child coming into a room. Usually it looks like a daycare or a playroom. There's some toys around, places to sit, this kind of thing. And you watch how the parent and the child interact. Then, after a little while, the stranger comes into the room and they all are kind of there. You again watch how is this child interacting with the parent? How are they interacting with the caregiver? Do they seem like they're using the parent as someone who they feel is safe? Are they playing with the parent? Are they ignoring the parent even now? And then my face might be blocking it, but over here is the stranger. So the parent leaves at some point, leaving the child with the stranger. And then you see, well, what does the child do? Does the child cry? Are they able to calm down? Do they go back to playing with toys? Do they care that the parent left at all? And so you kind of just watch the interaction between the child and the stranger. Then the parent comes back, and again, you say, okay, what does the child do? Are they able to calm down with the parent? Do they care that the parent came back? What are these interactions? And then oftentimes you'll leave the child alone completely, and the stranger will come back, and eventually the parent will come back as well, and this study will be, or the strange situation will be over. Depending on how you do these variations, it'll take anywhere between like 20 and 45 minutes. And it just depends how many of these kind of scenarios do you want. Do you want to have the child alone on their own, or are you going to take a little less time and not have them be on their own? But with that, you're looking for those specific interactions between the child and the presumed attachment person that they're attached to see do they have a secure attachment or do they have an insecure attachment. So, in this kind of situation, we see for secure attached children, they use the caregiver as a secure base. Essentially, they will rely on that caregiver there. They'll usually play around the room, but they might be nervous and like look back to the caregiver for concern and encouragement. They might even come back to the caregiver and then go back out to play. Oftentimes, they'll try to like involve the caregiver in what they're doing. They do often cry when the parent leaves. Not always, but they do often cry when the parent leaves. But then when the parent comes back, they will pretty quickly reestablish positive contact, calm themselves down, go back to playing, because they know that parent's going to be there for them. So this is kind of the blueprint that they've developed. Like over time, they've experienced that with their parent. Their parent is there for them. Even if the parent leaves, they do come back and you can call back down, this kind of thing. So it sets them up for a pattern to have a secure attachment across the lifespan. This is generally seen as the best one, the good one that we would like people to have in their relationships with their parents. Okay, another one is called insecure avoidant attachment. This one you'll also often see the child actively avoiding the parent in the room. They might look away from the parent. They might literally move away from the parent during all these interactions. So right from the beginning, as they're playing in the room, the kid might just completely be ignoring the parent. Oftentimes, the child doesn't interact with the parent. Or again, this can be done with father. This could be done with caregiver, like babysitter, grandparent, sibling in this kind of study. So caregiver in this sense is like the main attachment object that you're doing the study with, which again is usually mother. So with the insecure avoidant, the child doesn't try to seek contact when the parent comes back. They don't care that the parent leaves. They don't care that the parents come back. They're kind of avoiding that interaction. And they probably learned this over time because they haven't gotten much interaction from that parent. So even if the parent is home, they're emotionally unavailable or are told they can't help right now, that kind of thing. So insecure resistant is also called anxious. Each of these has had changes over time. So if you looked at modern research about attachment, you would see some other categories than we'll discuss here. But we're just going to focus on some of these basics that were originally studied. So insecure resistant, you might have heard this referred to as anxious. It's closest related to that. These children tend to be pretty clingy, but they also might show resistance to that clinginess, like trying to push parents away or just staying clingy, not exploring the room very much, even if they are by the parent or away from the parent, they're really not going anywhere else. Oftentimes, they're really, really distraught when a parent leaves, so they cry really loudly, and even when the parent comes back, they don't calm down. So they probably have an experience where the parent has had very inconsistent kind of responses to them. So rather than um, what's the term we used earlier today in class? Responsive caregiving, they haven't been getting consistent responsive care. And so with that, they've learned that sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. So they might want to push it away when it is there, and then they might want to cling to it if it is. It's a little bit varied. Originally, there was another category called insecure disorganized, and it kind of ended up being where they threw a lot of other children that didn't really fit the other categories. So we won't actually focus on it very much, but it was one of the original four. So think about this: secure attachment versus insecure avoidant versus insecure resistant or anxious. What kind of upbringings might lead to those different attachment styles? And depending on your and so why is this important? Well, it's important because it reflects on that relationship with the parent. It helps people learn what a secure attachment should be like, or how you should be attached to the people around you. So if you develop an insecure resistant or an insecure avoidant attachment with parents or that primary caregiver, then that's kind of the blueprint that you're going into early childhood relationships, middle and late childhood, adolescent relationships, that you're kind of expecting that from friends. So you think that's how you should act in relationships, that's how you expect they will act, and so it can set you up for more difficulty in these kind of socio-emotional interactions. Infants often learn how to regulate emotions with their attached people. And so they're probably not getting enough practice. They're not getting that sensitive caregiving to get that extra practice. And it also helps them develop neural pathways about how to expect to interact with people. So there's a lot of things going on with this attachment that connect with other things later on in life. So, depending on which class you are in, we'll do a variation on this activity where you'll watch a couple of the attachment examples. And so I will play them right here in this, but your instructions should let you know how we're going along with how to interact with these. You might have a completely separate activity. So, uh, and with that being said, maybe I won't actually play these. Read your instructions, play them in order, do whatever the assignment is saying to do, whether it's with group or just a report on your own, that kind of thing. But yeah, these are two examples for you to see, well, what kind of attachment style do these children have? So with that, this is related to our later on romantic development and having attached relationships to partners. So let's jump to early adolescence first and kind of the stages that we see in developing relationships. So we see these kind of three phases and they can like be adjusted, right? So this is 11 through 13 for entry into romantic attractions. You might see in some people's lives this can start far earlier or go even a little bit later versus consolidating to romantic bonds is pretty usually starting about 17 into the early 20s. So with this, the first one, entry into romantic attractions, this is essentially crushes. And so the reason we put the year at like 11 through 13 is we usually start counting it when the young people are hitting puberty. But usually this is just crushes. They have someone they like. They might never even talk with the person they have a crush on. If there's any kind of interactions between them, they're usually group interactions, like group hangout or something like that. Like they have a crush on the person in their friend group. And if they're going on individual dates, it's moving into the next stage, which is exploring romantic relationships. And so this is most common in the US in between 14 and 16. This is like casual dating, and usually it lasts, like these relationships last as like boyfriend and girlfriend, if they even have that kind of label, into weeks or a few months at most. Usually they're dating in groups rather than splitting off still at this time, even though there might be like split off things. And also, oftentimes, these relationships are really facilitated by friends. So you might ask a friend to give you the number of a person that you have a crush on, or ask a friend to check if that other person thinks of you that way, right? So there's a lot of communication by third parties, someone saying, hey, so and so wants to go to the dance with you, and you'd be like, oh really? Well, you should let them know that I want to go to the dance with them too, like that kind of thing. So not directly interacting is very common at this stage, but there could be obviously direct interaction too, but there's still a lot of standoffishness rather than kind of getting actually together and having those conversations together, still testing out the waters essentially. Then as we get a little bit older in the US, so closer to 17, we see more serious romantic relationships form. These can be a year or more of romantic relationships. Some of these might even go into like high school sweethearts, getting married a couple years later, that kind of thing. And this is one aspect of relationship development that parents tend not to be super happy with because in reality, these relationships, even though these are adolescents, these are pretty young people, they're very similar and pretty much the same as later adult relationships as well. So early adult, middle adult, late adult. So these are pretty serious emotional bonds that these people are making with the people around them. So they're much more similar to adult relationships than adults tend to give them credit for. There's a whole lot of shows with teenagers who are maybe 18 and seniors in high school and like fighting with their parents because, oh, this is just your high school crush. Like, you'll this isn't a big deal. This isn't important. When in reality, it is very important to these individuals that they're forming bonds with. That's not to say that they will all last more than a year, um, but it does happen as well. And so this is not something to be dismissive of as someone who's maybe a doctor or a mentor or a peer or a parent of these adolescents who are making these or having these relationships. So, with that being said, that is kind of the transition through adolescence of how we get these relationships. And one big area of research that's getting more and more research is how relationships develop with LGBTQ plus youth. And so, with that being said, we're the kind of pattern in psychology and medicine in general, and biology and many other fields have kind of been a focus on, hey, let's look at white young men and then kind of expand it to other white men and then expand it to other men in general, start including white women in samples, then women of color, and now we're doing a lot better job of including sexual minority people in this group too. So with that being said, we definitely need more research here, but there in the last 10, 15 years, there has been a big explosion, you would say, of this type of research. But still more to be looked at. So most of the research still is on heterosexual relationships, but there is a lot of grant funding as well. So that's one big thing in science is to do studies, it costs money. So like your time costs money, everything is costs money in this capitalist system. So there are a lot of grants now where there weren't before for doing research on LGBTQ relationships. So, and development over the lifespan as well as cross-cultural research. So, those are two of the big areas that have seen the like most growth in funding are things that are cross-cultural research and things on LGBTQ plus issues. So with that, some things that we do see is that for females in between the ages of 14 and 18, they're usually having their first same-sex activity sometime during then. Oftentimes they'll have a first sexual encounter with boys first. That might not necessarily be uh, something that they're wanting to do. It might be social pressure or even worse, but that is often the case, the pattern that we see. For males, we often see between 13 and 15 for same sex activity, and often their first sexual encounter is with boys. So, with that, for the relationships themselves, we kind of see some of the same patterns. The difference is if you take like the sheer number and like percentage wise of people who are LGBTQ plus, any study that you look at more recently is probably getting better numbers than the studies 10 years ago. People are a lot more open to share their sexual orientation. So 10 years ago, a good study would say about 5 to 8% of people are LGBTQ plus. The studies now are saying maybe it's closer to 15, possibly even 20% of people are actually LGBTQ plus. So with that being said, the stigma and social disapproval is part of the context of these relationships. So even if it is up to 20% of people, that still doesn't mean all of that 20% would want to date any given individual, right? So if you take a heterosexual couple, and let's even take that 20% number, because that makes the math a little easier. So then you've got about 40% of females and males that are both interested in each other, and so they've got about a 40% of the school, like a high school class. And so if you have, let's just make it really easy, a school class of 100 people, then your dating population could be up to what was the percent? 40 of those people, right? Versus if you're LGBTQ plus, you're going to have a limited opportunities. And other than that, they are different contexts than some of these heterosexual relationships because of the stigma and disapproval. So definitely more research is needed here. We've alluded to this a few times in this lecture today. Considering attachment and romantic relationships, attachments in childhood kind of set a pattern that we expect for relationships, close relationships, in adulthood. So this is related to our close friendships and also our romantic relationships. So in some ways, partners fulfill some of the same roles that parents did in childhood in the attachment relationship. So, for example, if you have a child with secure attachment, we talked about they use that parent as a secure base. They'll come back and show toys, go and play. They're trusting, warm. In an adult relationship, this has very similar features. Rather than like using that person as a secure base to go and play with toys, that person might be a secure base to support them, offer them comfort and security. They feel comfortable trying a new hobby, going for a degree, and that they know that person is there supporting them. So, still going out and doing things even independently and having that person still as a secure base. So, they also tend to have positive views of relationships and find it easy to get close to others as well. Another thing with these attachment styles, we not necessarily intentionally, but we tend to match up with partners who have the same kind of attachment style as we have. So if you've got two people with a secure attachment, that can end up with a really pretty easy to navigate relationship because you kind of expect it to be warm and to be a secure base. It can be a little more difficult if you have two people who have insecure attachments match up together. So, thinking of a child avoidant attachment style, for those children, their parents were emotionally unresponsive or rejecting, and the child learns to avoid that closeness even though they might want it. So, in adulthood, this kind of avoidant attachment style leads to hesitancy in getting involved in romantic relationships. They might become more distant from a partner more easily. Like when they see something to them that's a sign of maybe negative outcomes in the future, they're more willing to break things off really easily or not be as attached. And so, again, people who are avoidantly attached tend to, again, this isn't always true, but it is a pretty common pattern that someone with an avoidant attachment will get partnered up with someone with an avoidant attachment, kind of because it's what you expect from relationships. And so your expectations for relationships kind of matches this person's expectations for relationships. But that can make it more difficult if both of you are hesitant and both of you are expecting rejection as well. That can make things more difficult. Not impossible. You can still have a good, healthy relationship, but it might take a little extra effort. Also, maybe something like changing attachment styles with therapy, say like marriage therapy, for example. So another example, child resistant or anxious attachment. You're nervous and stressed about the relationship in childhood. You need that constant reassurance and affection. You have trouble trusting people. That is kind of the same in adulthood. So again, that's kind of the blueprint you have in your mind for how close relationships should go. So you might be demanding closeness, less trusting, more jealous or possessive, more emotional, more anxious in general about the relationship. And so that can be very hard if two resistant or anxious attached people are partnered up. Again, can work, can take some extra effort though. So with this in mind, going all the way through attachment styles, relationship development over time, let's talk about a theory of love. This is Sternberg's triarchic theory of love, and I think it's a good visual to think of when you are considering relationships in your own life. So let's talk about the three dimensions. The main dimensions here are those corners of the triangle, and these are passion, intimacy, and commitment. So I'll jump back to the picture. So we've got here passion, we've got intimacy, and we've got commitment. And those are the main triangles. And then all the other loves are kind of built off of a combination of these. So Here we'll start with passion. Passion is pretty simple. It's just a physical or sexual attraction. If you want to sleep with someone, that's the passion. And so you can have that alone, just that passion as the type of love all by itself, or it can be mixed to some of these other types of love too. So that is passion. Intimacy in the context of lifespan development. When we're talking about intimacy, we're talking about sharing things that are important to you. So your feelings of warmth, closeness, sharing those with one another, sharing your deepest desires, your dreams, these types of things, and that person sharing those with you. So that is being intimate. So passion is the physical sexual attraction. Intimacy is sharing things with a person, feeling that warm emotional connection. And then the last piece of the triangle is commitment. And so, depending on the time of the relationship, this commitment can be something like you have dates set up, like you're planning on going on dates. It could be that you are moving in together, that you're actually the boyfriend or the girlfriend, or it might be marriage, right? So, or you're having a child. Right. So these commitments can range depending on the time of the relationship. But the basic idea of commitment is that you intend to maintain the relationship even if problems occur. You'll be there for the person, they'll be there for you. You do things with or for the person. And so each of these, again, can be their own type of love. You can have just that passion alone. You can have just that intimacy alone. You can have just that commitment alone. And so with this, you might consider some situations that this might be the case. Maybe at the beginning of a relationship, you just have this passion or infatuation, just that sexual desire for someone, and that is where it starts. Maybe that's all it is as well. But maybe over time it evolves into something different. Intimacy. Maybe a lot of your friendships are just based on intimacy. Even other relationships as well, that you share things with them, people share things with you, and you have a lot of intimacy in those relationships. You can also have a relationship just built on commitment. It's kind of a sad one to think about. Of empty love is another way that this is called. But if you consider that, when you only have that commitment, when you are doing things for a person, maybe they're doing things for you, but you don't have any intimacy, like you're not sharing things about them, they're not sharing things about themselves, or you don't have that passion, the commitment alone, you might consider an example like caring for an aging parent who maybe has a neurodegenerative illness, is not actually able to share intimacy with you anymore. They're not able to share anything with you. You might share with them, but it's kind of hollow that way. And so all it is really you have a commitment to this person. You will be there for them. So these are all individual types of love all by themselves. And let's talk about how they can be put together as well. Consummate love is the one that if you're going to, say, a marriage and family therapist, a therapist would be probably trying to get you to. And so it is putting all those three main components together. It's the intimacy plus the passion plus the commitment. So that is consummate love. So if you are in a long-term relationship with someone, that's probably the one that you're looking for. So you have both that passion, you have that intimacy, and you have that commitment all together. So with this, using this model, you can kind of look at the different relationships in your life. If you have a long-term relationship and you feel like things aren't where you want them to be, well, what's missing? Is it passion for you? Is it intimacy for you? Is it commitment for you? And you can kind of use this model to kind of pinpoint and work on that. And that's kind of what one of the things that a marriage and family therapist might do if you went in to talk to them. So, infatuation is when you have passion and no intimacy and commitment. And I think we talked about that one already. So that one's over here, just the passion alone. Maybe that's all you've got in a relationship. Maybe that is where you want it to stay. You don't expect to be knowing this person for very long to make commitments or share intimacy with them. And then affectionate love is maybe one of the most common types of love that people experience in their life. So, affectionate love or companionate love is over here, and it is putting together intimacy, so sharing things about yourself, being warm, like having feelings of warmth, and commitment, like you'll be there for the person, they will be there for you, but it is not including the passion or the sexual desire for the person. So, consider for a second, maybe pause the video and think of any relationships in your life that might fit this companionate love point. So hopefully you did that, paused and thought of some. Some good examples are if you have friends, like really good friends that you love, that you don't have any kind of sexual interest in, you probably want companionate love with them. Maybe siblings. Maybe you want really good relationships with your siblings. You want to share things with them. You see them regularly, whether it's holidays or maybe weekly or monthly, or you are always like calling or texting them. So that would be companionate love. So a lot of relationships in our lives really fit this companionate love piece. So, and that's another way that you can look at this model is say, well, this relationship with this specific person isn't quite as strong as I wish it was, or I feel like it's not as strong as it used to be. Well, what's missing? Is it missing that intimacy? Are you not actually talking very much anymore? Is it the missing of commitment? So you're not able to go and see each other as much or do things together. So you can use this model to kind of pinpoint those types of things. And then another one is fatuous love. And so that is passion and commitment without intimacy. So here, that one is here at the bottom. You've got the passion or that sexual desire for a person, commitment. So you have made some level of commitments to this person. So I can think of two examples here. One might be friends with benefits, where you don't actually share any intimacy. You're not sharing things about them. You don't really have any feeling of warmth. You're just there to have sex, and you also have like set times. So that as a commitment, that would be an example. I often think that the Bachelor and Bachelorette show, I really feel like at the end when they are proposing, they're making a really big commitment, but they've only spent a few hours together total, right? Like individually as dates, maybe up to like 3 total days or something like that. I really feel like it probably fits this fatuous love that they have that passion, they're making a big commitment to one another, but they don't know a ton about each other yet. They haven't been intimate as much as you might expect someone to be if they're going into a marriage. And then the only one that I don't think we've hit on is not actually listed in the slides as I look at it, is romantic love over here. And so that is putting together that intimacy, sharing things with someone, and that passion, that sexual desire. And so romantic love and kind of this whole side, I think of this whole side as like the rom-com side. So a lot of rom-coms, you'll start with people starting to share things about themselves. Maybe you'll start off the movie with them having some sexual desire for one another, and then it kind of adds that other piece. So if it started with the intimacy, then they start to have that passion, or if they started with a passion, they start to build that intimacy. Some drama happens in the last in like the two-thirds point of the movie. Then after that drama, after they figure it out, they move to some commitment. So they move over to consummate love. So I think a lot of rom-coms kind of live in this romantic love area. And a lot of early relationships too. A lot of early dating relationships. You might start with that passion or start with that intimacy, bring in the passion or intimacy as you are developing a relationship. So each of these types of love is useful and valid, and they're all good things. But again, you can use this model to try and kind of pinpoint where do you want your relationships to be. If you have a sibling that you want to be closer with, well, are you missing some intimacy with them? Are you missing some commitment with them? If it's a long-term partner and you're wanting consummate love, which piece of this are you missing? Are you missing that passion? Are you missing the intimacy and sharing things with them? Are you missing that commitment? So these are things you can kind of pinpoint. So hopefully you can kind of see that trajectory of things like attachment over time to people and having those patterns of attachment, and then these types of love as well. So in the slides, there is a link to a video about this triarchic theory of love. It goes over the same basic definitions that I just talked about, but it has additional examples. So if you're still a little bit confused, feel free to go through that. But that is all for chapter 10. So again, make sure that you are looking at your syllabus so you are going on to the correct next chapter depending on what is in your syllabus.